In 1992, when the Babri Masjid was demolished, I was an undergraduate student in JNU. And December is the time that we used to get our break. So the situation was extremely tense, but we wanted to go home. So we took a train from Delhi to Patna. And I remember in that particular journey, I was very conscious of my language, because I didn't want to say something which could give people a clue that I'm Muslim. So my name is Dr. Rizwan Ahmad. I'm Associate Professor of Sociolinguistics in the Department of English Literature and Linguistics in the College of Arts and Sciences at Qatar University. I have been working here for the last 10 years. Before joining this department, I worked at American University of Kuwait, and before that I went to University of Michigan Ann Arbor for my PhD, where I worked on my dissertation on the social, political and cultural meanings of Urdu in independent India. I received my PhD in 2007. In my dissertation, which is a very extensive study of Urdu in independent India, I had to understand, in order to understand Urdu in independent India, you need to go back a little bit into history. And so I examined how Urdu was treated during the 19th century Hindi nationalist movement, which was also Hindu nationalist movement. As historians will tell us, the second half of the 19th century was both the formation of national identity in opposition to the British in pursuit of the freedom for India. But it was also simultaneously sort of the formation of Hindu nationalism. And so if you really want to understand Urdu in independent India and some of the things that have happened in the last 6-7 years of the BJP rule, you cannot understand it without really going back into the 19th century. So if you do that, then you find that there is a continuity that stretches from the late 19th century until today. So, and I find that to be very fascinating. So in some ways, some of the things that you may have noticed today in India, for example, attack on Urdu in India. For example, in the state of Uttar Pradesh, a few years ago, 3 members of the legislative body took their oath in Urdu, but the speaker declared it invalid on some technical grounds. Now remember that in UP, Urdu is the second official language. Urdu is also one of the scheduled languages in the Constitution of India. So you can see, why would an oath taken in Urdu be declared invalid, null and void? Because of the choice of the language, because when you take an oath, it's the content of the oath that matters. And actually, in the same assembly, many BJP members took their oath in Sanskrit, and that was allowed. Although you know that very few people understand Sanskrit. It's one of the great classical languages of India, which as a linguist I appreciate and I admire. However, in modern India, the number of people who understand Urdu is way more than the number of people who can understand Sanskrit. But so you can see that there is something else that's behind this particular act. If you read the Urdu tradition, Urdu historiography, you come across Urdu as a Lashkari Zaban, a language that was somehow born in the camps, in the Mughal camps. Of course, languages are not born like that. And sometimes people will also say that this language was created as it were, in the camps to facilitate communication between different people. Now, languages cannot be created. We know that. As linguists, we know languages don't get born in camps. And some scholars have dealt with this issue, and that had to do with the word Urdu. Now, the word Urdu is of Turkish origin, which means camp. Now, one of the oldest names of Urdu was Zabane Urdu-e Mualla, which literally, it's a Persian structure, which means that the language of the royal court, or language of the exalted court. Now, the name is pretty long and heavy and mouthful. So gradually what happened is that it began to be shortened. So instead of Zabane Urdu-e Mualla, it became Zabane Urdu, which literally meant the language of the royal court or the court. And then the language got dropped, the word Zaban got dropped, and then you were left with Urdu. So based on this, people just imagined, because the word Urdu means camp, so it must have been born in the Mughal camp. Of course, it's fictitious. It's impossible for a language to be born in courts. I mean, the only language that can be born in that kind of a situation is Pidgin, which Urdu is not. Urdu is a full-fledged language with a long history of literature, poetry especially. So that was the Urdu speakers' contribution to the framing of the origins of Urdu. So, the moment you say that it was born in a camp, so it looks like, okay, it was born in a Mughal camp, so it must be foreign. But more than this, there was a very concerted effort in the 19th century to sort of delegitimize Urdu. And I have written quite a lot on this and published papers on this. And this had to do with the rise of the Hindu nationalism. So, if you go back into the history, in 1837, until 1837, Persian was still continuing as the language of administration and the lower courts. So the British took over, but they did not change the official language of the administration, which was Persian. But in 1837, in the northern part of India, which is currently UP and the adjacent states, it was changed to Urdu. And then, beginning with the late 1850s, early 60s, a movement begins in North India by Hindu nationalists. Of course, at that time, we didn't have the right-wing political parties born yet, but people with similar ideologies existed in different political groups. And so the movement starts in favor of the recognition of Hindi as a language of the administration. And many documents were prepared in support of Hindi, why Hindi should be the official language rather than Urdu. And I have examined some of those documents, and I would like to mention two major documents that I've very closely and critically looked at. One is a memorandum that was submitted to the British by someone called Shiv Prasad. It's a 6 or 7 page document, but it lays down some of the main arguments about why Urdu is not a language fit for this. And similarly, there was another document that was submitted in 1897 by a group of people to the British for the recognition of Hindi. And these two documents, if you read them carefully, you will see that some of the arguments that you see today about the foreignness of Urdu, you find them there as well. So people, you will see, for example, Shiv Prasad arguing why Urdu is not a good or appropriate language for administration. He says that because it is foreign, because it has words that are foreign, it has a script that is foreign, and therefore our nationality cannot be expressed using this language. Whereas, Hindi is indigenous, its script is indigenous, and therefore it has a better claim on the national identity of the country. So that you see, so the idea of foreignness actually comes from there, and unfortunately, this ideology continues today, and it appears in many different forms. So I would like to just give you one example of something recent. It happened in, I think, 2016 in Delhi itself. So the Delhi government was trying to beautify the public walls in Delhi, and it ran a competition of different types of things that can be put on walls. And one of the entries for the competition was also poetry. And somebody submitted a couplet, an Urdu couplet, a sher, basically praising the resilience of Delhi, like how Delhi, despite many centuries of political fights, continues to thrive. So this entry won the competition. So two artists, one from Jamia Millia Islamia, and in collaboration with a French artist, both of them were going from place to place, trying to write this couplet on the wall, or on the walls of public spaces like bridges and so on and so forth. And something interesting happened, that as they were writing this thing, a group of people from the neighborhood came and they stopped them. And they said, "Who are you guys? And why are you doing it? And what is this?" And what was interesting is that they said that, "No, you will not be allowed to write Urdu here. We can tolerate anything, but not a foreign language." Right? So you see that happening in 2016. And actually, they threatened them, and they introduced themselves as members of the RSS. And they threatened them and forced them to paint over what they had already written. And they asked them to write Modi and Swachh Bharat, Clean India. So, you could see how something that was happening in the late 19th century about this wrong but ideologically perpetuated perception of Urdu as a foreign language continues even today. And this is not the only example. I mean, in one of my recent research papers, I have documented several instances like this, where Urdu was attacked simply because it's Urdu. And of course, the reason for that is, as a linguist, we know that languages are not just means of expressions or vehicles of thought. Languages are also symbols of identity. So the reason why this is happening, or this has been happening for over a century, is because of the speakers of Urdu. So, of course, in the 19th century, there were a lot of non-Muslims who also learned, spoke, read, and wrote in Urdu. But still, Urdu, the fact that it uses the Persian script, the contribution of Muslims, it thrived in many Muslim courts. So it does have that tag, right? So because in the right-wing ideology, Muslims are foreigners, and therefore in the north at least, it doesn't apply as much to the south, probably. But in the north, since in the right-wing ideology argues that this Muslim rule is foreign, they were invaders. And actually Modi, in 2014 or 16, he said something interesting. He said, we need to fight against the slavery of 1400 years.
Slave mentality.
Yeah, slave mentality of 1400 years. But then you want to find out slave mentality or for 1400 years, where did this come? Actually, there was a very interesting cartoon in the Hindu where the cartoonist is trying to say that Modi got the math wrong, because if you go add up the numbers, it doesn't add up to 1400. I mean, of course, we generally agree that the British colonization was of that type, but what he's trying to do, he's trying to lump the British colonialism with the Muslim era into one, and claim them to be foreign. And then once the Urdu-speaking Muslims are foreign, the language also becomes foreign. Yeah, so I mean, you see, when you look at language, languages can be proxy for people, right? So for example, in the United States, African American English has been at the receiving end. But why? I mean, it's a language. It's a language very similar to standard white English, right? People understand. So when the rapper Eminem raps, it's not that the white people don't understand. They do understand, right? So the attack against Black English is not because of the language, but because of who speaks this language, right? So remember all the time, anytime you're trying to understand social political situation of language, you have to understand the speakers. Who are the speakers? Because language is being used as a proxy for its speakers. So there's nothing in language that makes anyone violent or anything. I mean, if you look at the late 19th and early 20th century, some of the literature of Arya Samaj people exists in Urdu. And actually in my research, I interviewed somebody who was in his late 70s in Old Delhi. Somebody who read basically his Gita, Ramayana, everything in Urdu. He actually could not, he's Hindu from Punjab. He could not read the Hindi script at all. And he says that actually Hindi is foreign to me. And I found it interesting. I go to meet with him and I see an Urdu newspaper on his desk. And then I asked him about his experience as a Urdu speaker, and he tells me that he takes out his religious scripture from his desk and shows me, and which was in Urdu. So if you're seeing that a language is being targeted, remember that it's not the language. It is it's the speakers. Because if you look at the Urdu language, of course there is a bulk of Islamic literature in the north was produced in Urdu. But Urdu also has tons of secular literature, some even anti-Islam literature in Urdu. So there are many atheists, right, who have written poetry about their faith or lack of faith or whatever in Urdu. So Urdu is not a language. I mean, it's a language of poetry. So you also have love poetry. Some of the, ghazals are pretty romantic. Some of them could be even very racy. But so it's not a language that's confined to religious literature. You have novels, you have poetry, you have some early books also had scientific stuff written in Urdu. So so that's the link basically. If you unless you see the link, you will not be able to understand. Yeah. So if you keep the 19th century thing in your background, then you realize that there was a lot of tension in the Constituent Assembly debates. There were those who were asking for Sanskrit to be the official language of India. Of course, politically, they belong to the right-wing ideology, but that didn't seem like a possibility because, I mean, Sanskrit, as great a language as it is, was not a living language in the 20th century. Even now it is not, and therefore it couldn't be. So finally, then there was a very heated argument between the supporters of Hindi and Urdu. And in the Constituent Assembly debates, when the voting took place, it was a tie. Yeah, and so the chair of the Constituent Assembly debate had to break the tie in favor of Hindi. But there's a very interesting, so this is about how Hindi was adopted as an official language. And by the way, this is something that I think I need to clarify, that Hindi is not a national language of India. A lot of people think that Hindi is the national language of India. And by the way, very interesting, our vice president tweeted in Urdu on the occasion of Eid, and he, congratulated the Muslims in India in Urdu. And you could see lots of people were responding to that tweet and attacking the vice president, why he chose Urdu. And they said that you are the vice president of the country. You should choose the national language of India, which is Hindi. Of course, I mean, it's not true. I mean, India does not have, or at least Hindi is not a national language of India. So Hindi is official language of India. And there's a difference between the two. Because ours is a very multilingual country. So there was, if you call Hindi a national language, what are you going to call Tamil? What are you going to call Malayalam? What are you going to call Punjabi? What are you going to call Telugu? Yeah. What are you going to call Marathi? Are they not national languages? So this was all debated during the Constituent Assembly debates, and that's why they agreed that in the interest of the unity of the people of different linguistic backgrounds, it's better to term Hindi as an official language rather than as a national language. And English was declared as an associate official language. So, I mean, you see that even today, I mean, of course, the vice president knows that Urdu is one of the languages mentioned in the Constitution of India, and he chose that to largely, address his greetings to the, North Indian Muslims. But then you have these right-wing trolls attacking him with, false information that Urdu is not a national language. Hindi is a national language, so he should not have done it in Urdu, right? So that was the politics of the thing. But there's a very interesting study actually. If you look at the articles of the Constitution itself, there's a lot of bias in favor of Hindi. And there's somebody who has studied it very closely. It's a published article. For example, this is the language in the Constitution. They had to say that Hindi is Hindi, but what? So there's the Hindi written in the Devanagari script. So they had to mention the script of the language. Why? Because they were worried that if not written, the balance could go in favor of Urdu. So it was clearly mentioned, and there was a lot of debate about that too. So eventually the article that was finally adopted has, this in. And of course there is another place where it says, the Hindi language will be enriched by relying on words from Sanskrit in addition to other languages. But Sanskrit is very specifically mentioned. So you can see that kind of a bias in favor of Hindi. And of course, I mean, unfortunately, if you want to call it, The fact that Urdu became the official language of the state of Pakistan, that also had something to contribute to it. That people began, and people, especially the right-wing people, began to see Urdu as a language of the enemy, as a foreign language, as if it were. I mean, even now the number of Urdu speakers in India is huge, despite the fact that in the state of UP, people, because of the policies, people are not able to learn Urdu anymore, other than only a few of elementary and middle schools.
What happens if a government is discouraging a language, and what is the end result of that?
Yeah, I mean, the results are very serious. So whether it's the marginalization of Urdu or the marginalization of any other Indian languages, if you promote only one language in a country that is essentially multilingual and multicultural. I mean, I come from northern part of India, and I speak a bunch of dialects and Urdu and Hindi. So the result is that this linguistic richness will die out. So today you have, for example, if somebody from North Bihar, for example, they might speak Maithili or Vajjika and Hindi or Urdu. Now, if this linguistic diversity is not encouraged, maintained, and actually allowed to flourish, then you will see in future some of these languages dying. And actually, United Nations has warned that today, out of the 7,000 languages that are spoken in the world, half of them will die out before the end of the century. So, which is a very serious threat for our understanding of languages, our understanding of cultures, our understanding of different identities that are associated with different languages and cultures. So it is pretty serious. If languages are not being learned at home, there is a serious challenge. So there is a very simple formula or test, whether Urdu or any language for that matter is healthy or not. If you look at a family of 3 generations, grandfather, father, and children, if you see that the language is being transferred consistently between the 3 generations equally well, then your language is healthy. There's no threat to it. But if you see that your grandchildren are not able to hold a conversation, or they can't read the language of your culture, then that means it is not being passed on. That means it is under threat. It's facing a risk of extinction, despite all these big fanfare that you might see in big cities about Urdu or Hindi or any other language.
The problem is, like, you're talking about extinction, which is like by nature, by the forgetfulness of the speaker. But in India, there's an attack also. It's like it's an added burden for the language. That people who are speaking Urdu has been targeted. People with names of Urdu have been targeted. So, how do you feel that how imminent is this threat for Urdu as a language?
I think what you're raising is a very important question. You see, the survival of a language depends on its perception among the community. So the moment a language is perceived as negative, as foreign, for example, as anti-national or less patriotic than any other language, what is going to happen to the people who speak this language? They will try to avoid it. And actually, I have studied. So in Delhi, in 2005 and 2006, I spent about a year living within Old Delhi. And I found something very interesting, that children born and raised into Muslim families, studying in Zakir Hussain College, I found them speaking a language that did not sound like the language spoken in Old Delhi. So Yeah, I interviewed them. I interviewed them on campus, and I also actually traced them to their homes and found out about their parents and their family. And it turns out that they are shying away from Urdu because of these vicious sort of attacks on their identity as Muslims. So, Urdu is being tagged to their identity, and they are under attack for who they are. So, they are perceived as, let's say, less patriotic or less cool, even. For young people, becoming part of the group is the biggest thing, right? If you are not able to join a particular group in a school or college, then you are like an outcast, right? So if your language is a barrier, if you perceive that your language is not being seen as cool enough, then you will stop using it. And I'll give you a very example. So there was a girl who was studying in Zakir Hussain College, so I interviewed her, and I was interested in the pronunciation of Urdu sounds. And she pronounced the word Ghalib, the famous poet, as Ghalib, which is not the Urdu pronunciation. It's a Hindi pronunciation of Ghalib. So I was interested. So, I was able to finally, make an appointment with her parents. So I went to their house. I interviewed the parents as well as this girl at home. And at home, we were talking about Urdu and, very casual conversation. And she was able to pronounce Ghalib as Ghalib and Ghalat as Ghalat. So I became curious. I said, you see, I have your interview from a week or two ago in which you pronounced Gha as Ga and Kha as Ka. Kharch, like in Urdu we have kharch, like to spend something. And in Hindi it's pronounced as kharch. And she used to pronounce kharch. So when I asked her, she came up with a brilliant, like very eye-opening statement. She said, Galat is cool. And I was like, oh yeah, makes sense. So on campus, on the campus of Zakir Hussain College, when she is with her, Hindi-speaking, Punjabi-speaking, other language speakers, she does not want to pronounce Ghalat because she doesn't want to come across as somebody who is odd, and also shows her Muslim identity. So she, on purpose, which means that she actually knows how to pronounce the sound correctly, but she avoids it because of the negative association of the language and its speakers with these sounds. When the census people go to different places and they ask them, and our country is rural and a lot of people illiterate, so you go to somebody's house and you say, oh, what language do you speak? Now if they say something like Angika or some other small language, they would not write that language, they would write Hindi. So actually there are, I think 15 or 18, I'm not sure about the number, different varieties that are all subsumed under Hindi. So you can see that the number of Hindi will be inflated, right? So it's an attempt to beef up the number of Hindi speakers, number one. Number two, what you were referring to also happened. And actually, there's a very famous poet who passed away in 2020. His name is Gulzar Dehlavi. He was a Kashmiri Pandit. His name is Pandit Zulshi Gulzar Dehlavi. He has, in an interview with me, he talked about this, that in 60s and 70s, 60s actually, early 60s, he fought this battle that you were mentioning, that people would go, the census people would go to different houses, and even if the people said that their language is Urdu, they would mark as Hindi. But I also want to point out another thing, is that a lot of times Muslims, because of the identity associated with Urdu, they may not actually speak Urdu. But when the census people come, they might say that their language is Urdu. So that it can happen both ways. You see what I mean? So, so for example, you might find in a village where nobody's educated. Now, Urdu is a sort of urban language of the educated people. It didn't have a lot of roots in rural areas in North India. So if you have a village where, let's say, in a Muslim population, you see a lot of people returning Urdu as their language, you know that actually it is not the language that they speak at home, but it's the ideological choice. In the same way as many Hindi speakers might not speak Hindi at home, they might speak one of the dialects of Hindi, for example, Angika or Vajika or Bhojpuri, but they might say to the census people that they speak Hindi. So census is heavily ideological, and of course the census has been used in favor of Hindi, and in some cases also against Urdu.
Have you ever felt like speaking Urdu, like being from an Urdu background, has been a threat for you anywhere in your lived experience?
Yeah. You see, I'll narrate a very personal story. In 1992, when the Babri Masjid was demolished, I was an undergraduate student in JNU. And December is the time that we used to get our break. So the situation was extremely tense, but we wanted to go home. So we took a train from Delhi to Patna. And I remember in that particular journey, I was very conscious of my language, because I didn't want to say something which could give people a clue that I'm Muslim. So I avoided. I remember even pronouncing Urdu words like Hindi speakers would do. So I wouldn't pronounce Z, for example, or Kha or Gha. So I would pronounce Galat and Kharab, for example, which I usually don't. But that was the kind of worry. Recently, actually, there was a very interesting article written by someone from Aligarh Muslim University, and he claims that he's actually not religious or anything, but because of his name in his workplace, people dub him as Muslim, and he has become so worried that when he goes out, he tells his children not to call him Abba, the Urdu word for father. And he also, when he's on the phone, he would not say Assalamu alaikum or wa alaikum assalam, and these greetings that are unique to Muslims. So you can see that language is a badge of your identity, which you can either proudly display, as it happens in many countries, or the same badge of identity could be a threat against your own life, and then you try to avoid it.